Steinberger. Steinberger guitars do away with the headstock entirely, tucking the tuning mechanism straight into the body instead. The whole instrument is molded from carbon graphite rather than wood, which gives it a completely different weight and sustain than anything else in this list. It was designed in 1979 by Ned Steinberger, an industrial designer who had never built a guitar before in his life. That's likely why the shape looks more like a piece of modern furniture than a traditional instrument. Session musicians and touring professionals were the first to adopt it, mainly because it was compact, stable, and easy to travel with. Bassist Tony Levin, known for his work with King Crimson and Peter Gabriel, became closely associated with the headless bass version, using it on tours for decades. Headless designs mostly disappeared after that first wave. Decades later, metal players brought the look back, and headless guitars became common again in modern shred and progressive metal circles. Brands like Steinberger later built entire product lines around the same headless concept, proving Steinberger's original idea was simply ahead of its time rather than a passing gimmick. The original company eventually sold its guitar division, though Steinberger-style designs continue to circulate under different ownership today. Danelectro. Danelectro guitars were built from masonite, a cheap material normally used for cabinets and furniture rather than musical instruments. The pickups were housed inside actual leftover lipstick tube casings from cosmetics factories, since the company needed something cheap and metal to shield the coils. Nathan Daniel founded the brand in the 1940s to make affordable guitars for beginners, using whatever materials were cheap and available in the aftermath of the war. Nobody expected much from an instrument built out of furniture scraps and makeup packaging, but the unusual construction gave Danelectros a twangy, boxy tone that no other brand had, and it became especially prized in the studio. Jimmy Page reportedly used one during recording sessions, which only added to the brand's cult reputation later on. Collectors and studio musicians began seeking these guitars out decades later, specifically for that one sound, and Danelectro itself was revived in the 1990s after years of sitting dormant. The brand's cheap construction also made it disposable enough that Sears sold rebranded versions of it under the Silvertone name through mail-order catalogs, putting electric guitars into homes that never would have afforded a Fender or Gibson. Kramer. Kramer became the face of 80s hair metal almost overnight, mostly because Eddie Van Halen played one on stage during the band's rise to fame in the late 1970s. The company tried aluminum necks early on, but the idea didn't work well in practice, and they switched back to wood shortly after. From there, they leaned heavily into Floyd Rose tremolo systems, which let players dive bomb notes in a way that hadn't really been possible before on a production guitar. Their distinctive banana-shaped headstock became instantly recognizable across magazine ads and MTV appearances throughout the decade. When grunge took over in the early 90s, the appetite for flashy metal guitars disappeared almost overnight, and Kramer nearly went under completely. The brand name sat unused in storage for years afterward. Gibson eventually bought the rights and brought it back into production decades after the original company had folded. Modern Kramer reissues now lean heavily on nostalgia, marketing directly to the same players who grew up idolizing the brand's original 80s catalog. ESP Ltd. ESP became metal's brand of choice largely because of two names: James Hetfield and Kirk Hammett of Metallica, both playing signature ESP models for decades. The company actually started in Japan making replacement parts for other guitar brands, long before it ever built full instruments of its own. Its custom shop eventually became known for producing some of the most expensive and detailed metal guitars in the entire industry. Limited exists as the budget version, offering the same sharp angles and aggressive styling at a much lower price point for players who can't afford custom shop prices. Active pickups and neck-through construction were built specifically for speed and heavy distortion. Almost everything about the brand, from the tone to the visual design, was engineered around one single idea: heaviness. The company's custom shop in Japan still builds instruments for touring metal musicians who need guitars that can survive years of nightly abuse on the road. Rickenbacker. Rickenbacker guitars produce a bright, jangly tone that became inseparable from 60s rock the moment the Beatles and the Byrds started playing them on stage and in the studio. The company actually predates Fender's rise by decades. Back in the 1930s, they built one of the first electric guitars ever made, a lap steel nicknamed the Frying Pan because of its round body and long neck. Their 12-string models became especially famous, giving George Harrison and Roger McGuinn the chiming, layered sound that defined much of 60s folk rock. What's stranger is that Rickenbacker has historically avoided paying artists to endorse their instruments at all. Musicians simply picked them up because they liked the sound, not because of any deal happening behind the scenes. That reluctance to court celebrity endorsement is part of why Rickenbacker's reputation still feels tied to a specific era of music rather than any single modern player. Squier. Squier is Fender's budget division, created so beginners could get a Stratocaster-shaped guitar, without paying full Stratocaster prices. It started as a licensed brand name before Fender folded it fully under its own corporate umbrella. But a strange thing happened along the way. Certain Squiers made in Japan during the 80s are now considered by collectors to rival, or even beat, some full-price Fenders built during that same era. Quality control on those specific factory runs was unusually high compared to other budget lines at the time. Collectors track these particular guitars down today, sometimes paying more than a brand new Squier costs at retail. Fender has since leaned into that reputation, releasing higher-end Squier lines specifically aimed at players who want Fender quality without the Fender name attached. Epiphone. Epiphone used to be Gibson's biggest rival, a fully independent company founded by Anastasio Statopoulos and later run by his son, Epaminondas, whose nickname eventually gave the brand its name. It competed directly with Gibson for decades, building archtops and acoustics that rivaled Gibson's own lineup in popularity. Gibson eventually bought the company outright in the 1950s, absorbing what had once been a genuine threat to its business. Today, Epiphone exists to build affordable versions of Gibson's own most famous designs, from Les Pauls to Suisse, at a fraction of the cost. A company that once worried Gibson's executives now spends its entire existence working for them. In recent years, Epiphone has also started producing higher-end inspired by Gibson models, blurring the line between budget alternative and genuine competitor once again. Gretsch. Gretsch guitars are built big and hollow, producing a resonant, twangy tone tied closely to rockabilly and early rock and roll. The company was founded all the way back in 1883 by Friedrich Gretsch, originally making banjos and drums before guitars ever became its main focus. Their signature Bigsby vibrato arm, a spring-loaded lever that lets players wobble the pitch of a note, became just as recognizable visually as the tone itself. Chet Atkins built much of his career around that sound, endorsing a signature line that carried his name for decades. Decades later, Brian Setzer did the same thing, proving the Gretsch tone could define more than one generation of players. The company briefly stopped building guitars altogether in the 1970s before licensing its name back out, eventually partnering with Fender to bring the brand fully back to life. Yamaha. Yamaha built its reputation on reliability, offering consistent, well-made guitars at accessible prices for decades across every skill level. Few players realize Yamaha is also one of the largest manufacturers of pianos and motorcycles in the world, giving it manufacturing resources most guitar-only brands simply don't have access to. That consistency earned the brand a single label that stuck for years, the beginner's brand. Nothing more, nothing less. What that reputation misses is that plenty of professional musicians actually prefer Yamahas, specifically because of their build quality and consistency from one guitar to the next. Good for beginners and good enough for a world tour were never really opposites. They just got treated that way for a long time by guitar snobs. Yamaha's massive manufacturing scale also lets it experiment with hybrid acoustic electric designs that smaller boutique brands simply can't afford to develop. Ibanez. Ibanez became the go-to brand for shredders because of notoriously thin necks built for speed above everything else, including comfort. The name itself comes from Salvador Ibanez, a Spanish luthier whose guitars the company originally imported before it ever built its own. In the 1970s, Ibanez copied Gibson's designs almost exactly, right down to the headstock shape, until Gibson's parent company sued them over the resemblance. With no other option left, Ibanez had to design something entirely original to keep operating. That lawsuit ended up creating the exact look and feel that later made the brand famous in shred and metal circles. Steve Vai and Joe Satriani both became closely tied to Ibanez signature models, cementing the brand's reputation among technically demanding players. PRS. PRS built its identity as the third option in a market dominated for decades by Fender and Gibson, combining elements of both into something new entirely. Paul Reed Smith started out building guitars by hand and selling them backstage directly to touring musicians, before founding the official company in Maryland in 1985. There were no dealers involved at first, just word of mouth spreading among working musicians who liked what he built. The brand's bird-shaped fretboard inlays eventually became a status symbol of their own, recognizable from the audience. Obsessive build quality became the company's whole identity from the very beginning. Carlos Santana became one of PRS's earliest and most visible supporters, playing an early handmade model years before the company had any real name recognition. Taylor. Taylor changed how acoustic guitars are built by introducing the NT neck joint, a bolt-on design that made repairs far easier than the glued-in necks the industry had relied on for over a century. The company was founded in 1974 by Bob Taylor and Kurt Listug, two young builders working out of a small shop in California with little money. At the time, the bolt-on shift was seen as a genuinely radical departure from decades of unquestioned tradition. Taylor positioned itself as the modern, forward-thinking alternative to older, more established brands, and the bet paid off. Today, It's one of the most played acoustic brands on professional stages worldwide. Taylor also became one of the first major guitar companies to publicly address sustainable wood sourcing, even purchasing an ebony mill in Cameroon to control the supply chain directly. Martin. Martin has been the gold standard for acoustic guitars for over 190 years, longer than almost any other brand on this entire list has existed. It was founded by Christian Frederick Martin, a German immigrant who brought old world guitar building techniques to the United States in 1833. The company invented X-bracing, an internal support pattern that remains the industry standard even now, more than a century later. Nearly every acoustic guitar built since has, in some way, been reacting to a design Martin worked out in the 1800s, whether builders realize it or not. The company has remained in the same family's hands for 6 generations, a rarity in an industry where most historic brands have changed ownership multiple times over the decades. Gibson. Gibson took the opposite approach from Fender, gluing necks directly into the body and using humbucker pickups that cancel out hum for a thicker, warmer tone. The company was founded by Orville Gibson in the late 1800s, originally building mandolins before guitars became its primary focus decades later. That neck and pickup combination helped the Les Paul become the backbone of hard rock, since humbuckers could be pushed into heavy overdrive without the noise single coils tend to produce. Gibson has actually filed for bankruptcy twice in its history, once in the 1930s and again as recently as 2018. A strange fate for a company that owns some of the most recognizable guitar designs the world has ever seen. Even Les Paul himself, the guitarist the model was named after, reportedly wasn't fully satisfied with early production versions, despite lending his name and reputation to the design. He continued suggesting changes to Gibson for years afterward, some of which were adopted and others quietly ignored. Fender. Fender is built around the bolt-on neck and the single-coil pickup, producing a bright, snappy tone that became the backbone of rock, country, and blues for decades. Leo Fender founded the company in Fullerton, California in 1946, and he couldn't actually play guitar himself. He worked as an electronics repairman by trade, and he designed for manufacturing and mechanics rather than musical theory. That approach is exactly why it works so well commercially, from the very first models. Simple to repair, easy to mass produce, and built for people who just wanted to plug in and play without overthinking it. The Stratocaster and Telecaster went on to become the 2 most copied guitar shapes in history, all because of a man who never played a single note on stage. Leo Fender sold the company in 1965, and by his own account, he kept working in guitar design for the rest of his life without ever fully learning to play one.